Let's hope third time is the charm here as I sit down to fangirl my way through this discussion of the Virginian in this week's episode of the Virginian Vault. Friends, sometimes an episode of television comes along that has apparently been made just for you. And while this episode of TV is 61 years old, and I will be spoiling parts of this by the way, so you've been warned, they were bringing their Kim A-game with this one. So for those who haven't tuned in the past, this is the Virginian Vault, the show where I pop in and talk, analyze, discuss, review, fangirl my way through my first time watch of the Virginian, the 1962 to 1971 90-minute Western series that I discovered last year and have been slowly working my way through. Before I get too much deeper, let's get the IMDb plot synopsis out of the way. A crusty timberman threatens the rancher's grazing lands by clear-cutting. He and his foreman expect his daughter to marry the foreman, but she has second thoughts when a rancher's son shows some interest, thus resulting in a killing. Let's get to the cast, though. Just get ready for this. James Drury, of course, the Virginian. Martin Milner, William Smith, Joan Freeman, Arch Johnson, and William Bramley. And then, of course, we have Clu Gulager as Riker. So this episode, as I've discussed in the past, there's always a primary character here, and this is a Riker episode. We've had quite a few Riker episodes in this second half of season 3. I can only imagine it is because Doug McClure was away shooting or recently wrapped or promotion. Looking at the timelines, so this episode was released in March of 1965, and Doug McClure was in Shenandoah, the Jimmy Stewart 1965 Western, which released that summer. So that's my educated guess that McClure was probably pretty busy wrapping that one up. But looking at some further episode discussions, it looks like we do get him back a bit towards the end of season 3, because I have been missing Trampus more than I expected. But anywho, back to Timberland. Anyone who has followed piercing pop culture for any length of time will know Martin Milner is a sweet spot for me. I adore Martin Milner with every fiber of my being, going back to starting what I credit to be the first Martin Milner fan page on Facebook, back when Facebook was only college students only. And this is all stemming from a Jack Webb phase that I went through in high school, that I watched Adam 12 religiously. And that's carried me through. So Martin Milner, always and forever favorite. However, 2025 in my house was the year of William Smith. He was the number one, I believe, actor on my Letterboxd stats, and I have been having just a hoot going through all of the weird complexity that is his filmography. And that's continued this year because there's so much, and William Smith had no fear, and it's his work is an episode unto itself. However, this really comes at the beginning for him. So this episode is episode 25, as I've said. And so season 3, episode 30 is actually the pilot for Laredo, Virginian spinoff, starring Peter Brown, William Smith, Neville Brand as 3 Texas Rangers. So William Smith very likely had his role in Laredo at this point. We've seen him pop up in the Virginian before, but this is definitely the biggest and meatiest part. It's one of those delightful examples of a television show where you know that somebody's really liked by the creatives because they keep making appearances. Now, this might be just a me point, but holy star persona issues, Batman. I love each of these actors, but so William Smith plays I'll say the lovelorn, kind of tormented foreman, and Martin Milner is the rancher's son of the plot description. As soon as I read the plot description, I knew I was going to have an issue with this because if you're remotely familiar with any of these actors, and despite my adoration for Martin Milner, I have to say, in no universe does Martin Milner get the jump on and kill William Smith at all. This would not happen. This could not happen. And this kind of continues throughout this episode as Martin Milner plays probably one of the most un-Martin Milner characters I've ever seen him play. Pete Malloy in Adam 12, very stoic. Todd in Route 66. Martin Milner's always very straight-laced, very, he can play wide-eyed innocence with the best of them, wide-eyed, lovelorn. In this episode, at one point he tells the Joan Freeman character, the timberman's daughter, he looks at women. He chases women. We see at one point him going to try and hit on a saloon girl. And as soon as he said, "Oh, I like to, I like to watch. I like to chase women," I said, "No, you don't, Martin Milner. This isn't you." This episode could have had such legs had they just swapped Milner and William Smith. I can only imagine there was probably something to do with William Smith and all his bodybuilding bicep-ness looking far more realistic, hurling logs and working with trees and things because he is the foreman. However, the foreman's the boss. They don't necessarily need to be doing the work. Martin Milner could have played that part, and I think it would have hit their personas just a little better. However, I'm not going to complain over, each of this, and frankly, it was a Riker episode, and I've been deep, deep, deep down a Clu Gulager rabbit hole over the last year and a half, and it continues. It's been interesting to see the shift that this has gone through, definitely towards the end of season 3. And it was really propelled. Steve, played by Gary Clark, left the show or was let go from the show, I believe I read, at the end of season 2. He pops up a little bit into season 3, but not a lot. But as kind of we've hit the second half, Randy, played by Randy Boone, Betsy, played by Roberta Shore, Judge Garth, played by Lee J. Cobb, have all really disappeared. So in a rough, unforgiving 90-minute format, they're really having to lean hard on James Drury's The Virginian and Clu Gulager's Riker at this point. So it makes perfect sense why we would have an episode like this that leans heavy, heavy, heavy on the supporting cast, as well as episode 30, the Laredo pilot, which has a bit of Trampus. I'll talk about this one again in order, but I've already watched this one because I watched Laredo last year. That episode is completely on Peter Brown, Neville Brandon, William Smith's shoulders. So the main cast would need a break. They've gone from, 5 primary cast members who could support scripts and shooting to leaning on two main cast members, which I don't know if they could have even feasibly done with as long as this show was. The DVDs of these are 74 minutes, but add back in commercials and these would have been 90. I will say I am really missing Betsy. I adore her spunky little delightful presence. I need to backtrack. There's one Betsy episode that I love talking about, and I should post that as kind of an archival episode of the Virginian Vault, but I digress. And we're actually on the tail end of Roberta Shore's run with the show. I believe she leaves very early into season 4. She's actually only credited in one episode of season 4, which would be her final episode. And then Lee J. Cobb's Judge Garth looks like he finishes out season 4 before he leaves, and the show must change its pace. But that is for another episode, another time, another installment of the Virginian Vault. Timberland was a delight. With any of the particular issues I might have The star persona analysis, yes, it's a weird choice. It's a wacky choice, especially watching this show with 60 years of hindsight and a look at who these men, especially William Smith, would ultimately become. While Martin Milner was definitely in the midst of his career at this point, Route 66 would have just ended. William Smith was very much the beginning. A look at his filmography shows he had some roles as a youngster in the studio system. I've yet to actually locate him, but there's a credit in Gilda, there's a credit in Meet Me in St. Louis, so he would have been working when he was super young. But then he disappears, time in the army, time doing just some ridiculously prolific work. If you have not read up on William Smith's background, do it. It's a fascinating tale. I keep telling myself that I need to do a William Smith deep dive here on Piercing Pop Culture, because the complexity of this man who played so many cult beefcake strange roles, with his language proficiencies and his poetry, and there's just so much there that boggles the mind. But this was him on the forefront of his career, as I said, leading directly into Laredo, and then that would kind of transition to the career that he had in the 70s and 80s. So in the grand scheme of things, I think this feels like a bit of a weird episode of The Virginian, but weird in a good way. And I really like the episodes of this show that aren't afraid to get a little weird. That's really the reason why I started watching this show, because the pilot with Hugh O'Brien, the Executioners, wasn't afraid to get a little weird, and it kind of basked in the weird, and I kind of really loved that for this Western show that I was expecting to be stoic and moral and, Gunsmoke-esque. But this has been a year for me to explore TV Westerns, and I hope to continue doing it. But I will go ahead and wrap up this installment of the Virginian Vault, as it's already getting quite a bit too long, but I could talk about Martin Milner and William Smith forever. Thank you so much for joining me here at Piercing Pop Culture. Continue to swing back by. My regular drops right now are Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. I keep promising a contemporary movie review, but as you can tell, if you could potentially hear with my voice, I've been a little sick and have not been able to actually get out and see one, so that keeps getting pushed. But my regular recurring series will keep coming through, and hopefully another Virginian Vault here within the next week. If you are interested in more, check out my companion Substack at piercingpopculture.substack.com. I hope to start branching out my content some more over there, and as well on YouTube. But Piercing Pop Culture as a podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining me here. Have a good one all.